Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We're here for an episode of SKYLIT, and we're so lucky to have with us author Eric Wolfson to talk about his new book, 50 Years of the Concept Album in Popular Music, From the Beatles to Beyonce. Eric is also the author of the 150th volume of the 33 1/3 book series, in which he discusses Elvis Presley's From Elvis in Memphis. He works in the Performing Arts Division of the U.S. Copyright Office, and he lives in Washington, D.C. I'm so glad that he's here. I also just know this guy from the music scene in New York City when we were both there. I was there at the time that he recorded and released his album State Street Rambler, which you should find. It's on the internet. Go find it. It's really good. Anyhow, here's Eric Wolfson. Hello.
Thank you, Justin. Great intro. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me be here. Yeah. Thanks, SKYLIT Book. So I was just going to start by reading part of the intro just to sort of set it up.
Yeah, so we get a flavor of it. Sounds good.
Get a flavor. All right. So yeah, this book's about the concept album, and this part sort of sets it up. So what is a concept album? For our purposes here, a concept album is an album that takes you on a journey by virtue of its unifying mood, theme, narrative, and or underlying idea. When we talk about concept albums, we're talking about art, which generally requires some degree of intention on the part of the artist. There's some common traits for a concept album. They're generally a studio album or new songs recorded by one artist, as opposed to a live album or a compilation gathering older songs by one or more artists. A concept album's songs often run together in one or more suites, and sometimes have a central song or theme that is reprised before the end, often in the second to last or final song. Finally, the concept album usually has artwork tying the work together. To keep things from getting too unwieldy, I stuck with what I term popular music, which is essentially rock, pop, soul, and hip-hop. Albums from other genres like jazz, country, and reggae were considered, but ultimately left out to keep things streamlined. As we've seen, the concept album was not a format invented by rock and roll, but rather a loose structure that rock and roll built upon and perfected. Rock music came from its own rambling tradition, including train-hopping brakemen like Jimmy Rogers, blues journeymen like Robert Johnson, Western folk musicians like Woody Guthrie, northbound blues singers like Muddy Waters, and wandering lost souls like Hank Williams, all of whom collectively helped to birth a music that was as restless as their itinerant lives. For a music that came from 1,000 endless roads, rock and roll was the sound of breaking free. When Elvis Presley sang "I'm Leaving Home Now, Baby" on his first single, That's All Right, in mid-1954, he took the history of the music with him. And so it was until rock and roll lost its own path towards the end of the 1950s, when nearly all of its key figures hit a dead end. Elvis was in the army, Chuck Berry was in jail, Little Richard was in the ministry, Jerry Lee Lewis was in disgrace, and Buddy Holly was in the graveyard. A new generation emerged with music epitomized by songs like Dion's The Wanderer, which took a once dangerous music and sanitized it as empty fun. Several major new movements would save rock and roll in the mid-'60s, namely the influences of the Beatles and their British invasion counterparts, as well as Bob Dylan and his folk-steeped contemporaries. The key element for the rock and roll concept album was the introduction of psychedelic drugs, which internalized traveling through the rock music from a literal physical journey into a surreal psychological one. While Robert Johnson once famously sang about rambling on one's mind, the rock concept album introduced rambling in one's mind. The concept album provided a format in which one could take an extended trip through music without ever having to ingest a hallucinogen. Through the concept album, rock and roll transcends itself from a music to be enjoyed to a music to be experienced, and the album is the canvas for the expression.
Nice.
That's a bit of an overview.
Yeah. And I will say that, as a music nerd, I do have some bones to pick with some of your selections versus some of your exclusions. I'm glad that you stayed out, right? No country, because otherwise I'm just like, why is there no Willie? Why is there no Johnny Cash? Because
I know, and that was I had to just I had tasked myself to come up with 25 albums across 50 years, and I found that once I was including country, there were a couple albums that I really wanted to get in there that I didn't, including Redheaded Stranger. That was going to be totally in there. And honestly, for Johnny Cash, I had this weird place in my heart for the bicentennial record he did called America, where he's telling the history through all the states growing out west. Have you ever heard that one?
No, not that one.
it was kind of like not a hit and pretty obscure, but I always found that really interesting because it's like he's becoming like the voice of America or something.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I could have clearly done, the American Indian one or the labor work songs. I mentioned them in the introduction, but I just I felt like once I was bringing in people like that, then other people were getting thrown out that I wanted to keep in the picture.
Yeah, I mean that's the for the nerd, like the nerd, like the good and the bad is that like this I feel is a book that's like accessible to someone who likes music but isn't like super versed and wants to learn a little more. But like then you're also just sort of like, wait, what about, like you explicitly say like no Genesis, no Village Green Preservation Society. Like it's just sort of like, but what, like it's like I want to get into the weird mythology of all this dumb stuff, but it's like, you know what, there are other books. Maybe there'll be a volume 2 for the.
That's my dream. My dream would be to write a second volume, put in Village Green, put in The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, put on Redheaded Stranger. I think Randy Newman's Good Old Boys, I think, is a fascinating record. Maybe even Janet Jackson, Rhythm Nation. There's so many things once you start thinking, you're like, oh God, there's like so many records that you could do. And I think I might even include like There's a Riot Going On, which I kept going back and forth over whether or not I considered that like a true concept album.
Yeah.
Blind the Stone.
Were there other ones that were sort of like in the running that eventually you're just like, okay, the scope is too much. I have to lose it. It has to go. Like, were there any darlings you had to kill?
Yes, very much. I for a while, up until the very last couple of months, Nebraska by Springsteen was going to be in there.
Oh yeah.
But I decided that was a definite kill your darling situation because it was so hard to find stuff from the 1980s. The 80s were kind of a doldrum period until like the very end of the decade. So trying to get stuff from the mid 80s was hard. And with Nebraska, I guess it's sort of, for me, in some ways, it wasn't, I was always sort of convincing myself because it's sort of almost more of like what I would call a theme album as opposed to a concept album in terms of it doesn't tell one story. And it's sort of like snapshots from America, but then sort of when I was listening to the record and thinking about all the songs, a lot of songs actually still take place in Jersey, whereas I always think of the songs as being from the Midwest, and some of them are, but a lot of them are also just from like Jersey places. And so that compared to the fact that it was kicking out Zen Arcade by Hooster Doo, and that I was like, that is a concept album. So I'm like, I can't just favor Bruce, especially when everybody's written everything about Bruce, and arguably it's Nebraska is more of a folk record than a rock record, you could argue, because there aren't drums on it or anything. So I sort of held my nose, threw that out, and then that gave me for Zen Arcade, which some people have already, like I've reached out to a bunch of potential reviewers and stuff, and one guy wrote me back right away and was like, anything that has Zen Arcade in it, I am reading, and I am like very excited to write about.
Oh, so. That's nice. Yeah. I think we should take a little tour through the book, because what you've done is you've split it into 5 parts. You've picked 5 eras. I'll just say them real quick. So part 1, the founding era, 1967 to 69. Part 2, the golden era, 70 to 74. Part 3, the modern era, 75 to 89. Part 4, the postmodern era, which is the 90s. And then part 5, the new millennium. And I did find it interesting that like it does seem like the character of these albums changes, and I definitely spoiler, when we get to the 90s, I definitely have some questions for you about some of the things that were picked over other things, but I think we should.
90s were one of the very hardest decades. Like in the Airplane Over the Sea, that was always like, but yeah, I have arguments with me too about what I picked.
So I was hoping that maybe you could read like a little bit from these eras. So we'll go back to the first one, founding era, 67 to 69. You start off with Sgt. Pepper's. Well, what would you like to read from in that era?
I had the Zappa one ready to go just because it sort of addresses Peppers, but then it's the reaction. I just feel like I felt like I had to start the book with Sgt. Pepper because I personally don't feel like Pet Sounds is a true concept album. So for me, like Peppers really made it the step forward, and historically, all the conversation about concept albums seemed to happen in the press after the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper. Like that really seemed to be the kind of inciting incident, tipping point.
And one thing I like about what you've written, especially about that album where there's so much has been said, is that you're not putting it down, but you contextualize it for what it meant then and the way that shifts slowly in the press and in the way people perceive it now. I forget which publication you said, but like basically they put it at like number 87. Like it's the album that went from the best album ever to it's like the 87th best album ever. I thought that was kind of an interesting detail. And then also I'll just read all the titles from each section. So Sgt. Pepper's, then you have The Moody Blues, Days of Future Past, Frank Zappa and the Mother's Invention, We're Only in It for the Money, Jimi Hendrix Experience, Electric Ladyland, and The Who's Tommy. And I also like the way that you have the albums converse with each other, because especially in this first era, like people are definitely building off of what other people are doing. And so like, yeah, as you're saying with the Zappa, it's definitely like him arguing with the Beatles and arguing with like the counterculture in general. So yeah, I enjoyed that approach.
Thank you. I enjoyed writing it that way. And actually, We're Only in It for the Money was sort of like my sort of teacher's pet for the, like I would have pitched this for 33 and a third, but I'm like, no, this has to be in the concept album book whenever it comes out. So anyway, so this is from the We're Only in It for the Money by the Mothers of Invention. So by this point, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band towered over the rock scene, but Zappa wasn't impressed. Sgt. Pepper was okay, he later said, but just the whole aroma of what the Beatles were was something that never really caught my fancy. I got the impression from what was going on at the time that they were only in it for the money, and that was a pretty unpopular view to hold. Zappa's cynicism was reflective of a fundamental cultural difference between the mood of America and England in the mid-1960s culture. By the time George Harrison traveled to Haight-Ashbury in August 1967, he was expecting the hippies to, quote, all be nice and clean and friendly and happy. Instead, he found, quote, hideous, spotty little teenagers. He further described the afternoon as, quote, living in a erroneous Bosch painting. Indeed, had Sgt. Pepper been created in America, mused Beatles historian Ian MacDonald, where the clash between establishment and counterculture was violent, Sgt. Pepper would have been a reactionary pig, Lovely Rita an uptight bureaucrat. The Beatles, their age prejudice dissolved by LSD, were having none of this. Theirs was an optimistic, holistic view. The Mothers of Invention's We're Only in It for the Money was the American Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Released on March 4th, 1968, while Sgt. Pepper was still lodged in the American Top 20, it was the Rock and Roll Bride of Frankenstein, a sequel that, in sending up its source material, actually improved it. The album's artwork was the giveaway. The original cover was supposed to be a direct parody of the Beatles' already iconic album cover, only with all the Sgt. Pepper's glamorous Hollywood stars and spiritual gurus replaced by a freak show of controversial political figures, President Johnson twice, pop culture celebrities, Jimi Hendrix in the flesh, he was there for the actual photograph that was taken, infamous media icons like Lee Harvey Oswald getting shot, and of course freaks like Max Schreck as Nosferatu twice, many with black bars over their eyes. Unlike the artistic collage that had been done for Sgt. Pepper's Surreal Crowd, this version felt far more crude, a child's cut-and-paste job of the polished original. At the center was the Mothers of Invention, cross-dressed and stunned, holding the whole thing together. But this image wasn't allowed to be on the cover, Zappa always maintained, because Paul McCartney refused to grant him permission to do it. Years later, McCartney claimed otherwise. I never understood why Zappa blamed me for not being able to use the Sgt. Pepper sleeve. I don't think EMI would have stopped him or even could have stopped them. Zappa's artistic loss was his album's conceptual gain. Instead of using his faux Sgt. Pepper photo on the cover, he hid it on the inside, inverting Sgt. Pepper's artwork. Now, the inside gatefold of the Beatles album, the Beatles dressed in Sgt. Pepper suits against a bright yellow background, became Zappa's outer front and back cover, only with the Mothers wearing dresses against the same bright yellow background. Like the music it held, the artwork of We're Only in It for the Money literally turned Sgt. Pepper inside out.
Nice. And
Thank you.
And I really like that album. Like, as a general thing, like did you enjoy most of the albums that you had to cover? I think there's one in this era that it seemed like you were mixed on, and I'll ask you in a second. But
I think I might have a guess which one that is. Yeah, I kind of learned to love them because there's certainly albums that aren't my taste, but but I would be surprised. Like some of them really knock my socks off, like the Donna Summer one. Going into that, I was kind of like, it's just not disco and like that era. I'm just not generally interested in, but that album totally won me over. That's a great freaking album.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, but not everything's going to be like the greatest thing you ever heard. What's your guess for?
Well, I mean, there's two, but the Moody Blues Days of Future Past, you definitely are unsparing in describing some of the sections as just like, oh boy, what is this? Like,
Mea culpa on that one.
Yeah. Which is fair because that's an album that I remember I heard years ago. It did not stick in my brain, so I decided to play it while I was reading your stuff on it. And like I was having similar reactions where I was like, oh yeah, this orchestral passage just sounds like a bad Disney movie or
right. It does, like Sounds of the South or something.
Right.
Not even a good Disney movie.
But the one some of the things you said about one of the other albums that I take a little umbrage with is that you basically say that you think Tommy could be cut from 2 albums down to 1 album, and you pinpoint some of the songs that you really don't like. And I am a huge fan of the like macabre John Entwistle songs, Cousin Kevin and what is it, Fiddle? But like across the albums, I like his like macabre songs. So I enjoy like Cousin Kevin, but like, yeah, I mean, it seems a bit bad taste, and like I don't disagree with that aspect of your criticism. But I was like, oh wow, he would just cut 2 of the songs that I enjoy.
I would. And I don't think they've aged well, and not that it matters. Tommy will always be Tommy.
Right.
But I was just surprised as like when I was in college, I knew Tommy from, my mom was a huge Tommy fan and took us to see it on Christmas and everything. In college, I sort of was digging deeper. And so I got the deluxe version of Live at Leeds. And I'm like, oh, I'll listen to Tommy on the second disc. And it was not only amazing. I don't know if you've listened to the Live at Leeds where it's like Entwistle in one ear, like Townsend in the other, and like, the drums and the singing in the middle. And it's just, you can't believe it's only 3 instruments and 4 men that are making like all this sound. It's almost like Phil Spector type thing in its own way. And I was like, this is so much better than Tommy. Like, this is just, I just think it's tighter. I feel like it's more fun to listen to. And at that time, I then tried to buy every single live Tommy that they released, which at the time, like they did their Woodstock set that came out. They played it at the big 1970 festival in England, Isle of Wight. They played it there, and I got that CD. I got like every CD that had a live version of it. Yeah. Because they were all slightly different. And the Leeds one was just the best. And part of why I think it's good is because it cuts the underture, which I still don't understand why that's there. Right. Especially taking the Rael riff that's, used much better on Who Sell Out. Right. I can tell we could be here for days talking about this. I love it. Yeah. No.
I agree, actually, but and that I will give you. I do think the live performances of Tommy are more interesting than the album, probably.
They're faster too, which is fun.
Yeah. And also like, that the plot of Tommy, like the movie lays bare that the plot of Tommy shouldn't be a story. It shouldn't. And I say that as a huge fan who like was, first heard it when I was like 12 and like have never like it's, I haven't even been able to really get into Quadrophenia because I'm like, well, it doesn't give me the same feeling that Tommy gives me. So.
Totally. No, I bought the Criterion of the Quadrophenia movie being like, oh, here's what will get me into it. And I'm just like, thing's weird. That's like what I got out of that.
Yeah. All right, cool. Let's move to the next era. Let's go to the golden era, 1970 to 74. Here you are covering Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. This isn't coming up, but it's Joni Mitchell's Blue, right? And then Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And then, and then Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. Heard of it?
album I was heard of a little bit there.
What did you want to read from this section?
I'll read from the Marvin Gaye one just because it's relatively short, and I don't want to use up all your time here.
Oh yeah, no, but this is fun. As long as I'm having fun, that's all that matters.
Sweet. I'll still do Marvin Gaye because this is, I don't know. I think it's interesting how, well, I'll read it.
Yeah, cool.
On May 3rd, 1977, Marvin Gaye appeared on Dinah Shore's television show where she asked about her favorite album of his, What's Going On. I learned today that you consider that a concept album, as did I, she tells her in her soft and lilting southern drawl. Would you explain what you meant by that? Gaye thoughtfully stumbles over his words as he attempts to set the scope of the project. Well, when the world and, well, the State of the Union was, and, well, the Vietnamese War was raging hot and heavy during the period we conceived it, and there was a lot of unrest in America. There were college kids being shot in campuses. My brother was at war, and I prayed a lot that he would come through safely. It was a very trying period for me at Motown even. Shore redirects her questioning to be more about the album's universal themes, as Charlie's Angels star Kate Jackson looks on starstruck, mesmerized by Gaye's words. I tried to write a general kind of broad statement, Gaye responded. I didn't want to step on any toes particularly, and I still don't, but it was quite an experience. I don't recall much about the album. I feel that it was very divine and, well, very personal, very divine. I don't hardly remember writing these songs. I mean, it was like I was in a kind of some sort of a other dimension or something when I did it. Although Gaye is only 38 years old and nearly as many years away from making What's Going On in 1971 as he was from getting killed in 1984, he speaks about his masterpiece with the bemused detachment. If, as Shore implied, Gaye had just declared his masterpiece a concept album earlier, he now hovers around the term like a pilgrim looking back and trying to figure out how he got to where he is. So
yeah,
that's for the.
It's interesting because I do wonder if like concept album when did it go from being like sort of like, because you talk about this in the intro a little bit, like from like a marketing term that's a good thing. It's like, this isn't just a bunch of singles. This isn't a concept album or an album concept either way, to like something that maybe like feels too highfalutin and too pretentious, schoolboy exercises or whatever. Like, was it that quick? Like, do you think it was that quick, or I don't know?
I think Zappa was proving that it was that quick because he basically made like a Mad Magazine parody of Sgt. Pepper, and like that, not even a year away from Sgt. Pepper coming out. So I think that was already, because in my book I do discuss people like Thick as a Brick, which is also in this section, like that Ian Anderson was purposely going out to kind of like play up the whole concept album thing.
Yeah.
I do think it very quickly turned from this term of endearment to, probably marketing term is more accurate, like you said, to then something that could be sort of like, oh, maybe that's not so cool. Like, I don't know if punk rock would have happened the way it did if it wasn't for the concept album,
Yeah.
It's just one of those things.
Yeah, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, it was about Thick as a Brick. The thing that's so funny about that is I definitely looked at my friend's vinyl copy that has like that whole fake newspaper on it. I remember that so well. And just like being like, this isn't real, right? Like, this isn't really like based on a story by a kid who's known as Little Milton for writing this epic. But I liked your story about how sometimes they're like, potentially lazy rock writers would be like, oh yeah, it's written by a small boy who is nicknamed Little Milton. It reminds me of, I forget what name he used, but there's a John Carpenter movie called Prince of Darkness where he didn't want to give himself writing credit. He just was like, I don't want people to think too hard about this. So he came up with a fake name and in the press kit gave the guy a fake bio. So then people were like, yeah, it's written by this rocket scientist. And it's like, no, it was written by John Carpenter who made up a fake rocket scientist.
That's crazy. That's almost like Andy Kaufman level as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Wait, so we're in the 70s. Oh, so I do have a question. So the last one you profile in in what you call the Golden Area 74 is Dark Side of the Moon. And I feel like when it comes to concept albums by Pink Floyd, so you only do one album per band, obviously, because there's only so much space.
That'd all be like the Pink Floyd book and the, whoever book.
But like, what drew you to do Dark Side versus The Wall? Because I feel like most people's go-to when they think of Pink Floyd concept album, maybe because of the movie, is just The Wall. So what made you pick Dark Side instead?
I agree. And originally, I remember early on that I even switched them out for each other at one point.
Oh, wow.
But I decided to, because I always liked The Wall growing up. I mean, it's got some sort of extra baggage, but, even before I knew it was made into a movie when I was a kid, I'd listen to that record and be like, wow, this is really doing something cool.
Yeah.
I liked Dark Side of the Moon because it was earlier, it's cleaner, it's more consistently excellent, just because it's, half the length of The Wall. And while The Wall tells like this rock star story, I sort of felt like I'd already addressed that a little bit with the Ziggy Stardust chapter, that I'd sort of covered that theme before. It just would have felt like if you didn't get to Pink Floyd till like the end of the 70s, I would have felt like something was missing. And Dark Side of the Moon, more than any other album, is like an epic upon itself in that, unlike Sgt. Pepper, like people still think it's amazing. They still buy it. And it still will have the, Billboard Top 200 now and then, just because it just happens to sell really well in a week.
Yeah.
All that just sort of, I liked that it was Pink Floyd's, not just best album, but they all seemed to be really getting along. Like as a team, it was their most collaborative album, which I thought was really interesting. And for me, it almost was a warm up in some ways to Shine On You Crazy Diamond, because there's Wish You Were Here, because I think they were sort of like dealing as a band with sort of the withdrawal of Syd Barrett's demise. And I thought that was a really interesting theme, and the whole idea of like using madness and whatnot, which The Wall does in a very different way 5 years later. But I think the fact that you're doing it for the first time, I think for the fact that really set a new standard for how good a rock album could sound. And it's just sort of like a neater thing to work with, whereas The Wall's like pretty extravagant and sort of, overblown in a way.
Yeah.
Even though I still love The Wall, but I just felt like for here, if I didn't get to Dark Side, there was just something sort of viscerally essential about it, about how the songs run together, about how people will just listen to it over and over again, like all in one sitting, not like, okay, I'm going to turn on track 3 or whatever.
Right. Yeah. The whole continuum of it.
Yeah. And I also see it as like the album, sort of the rock album's probably peak. Originally, the manuscripts, like way back, was going to like end with Dark Side. I thought that was an interesting place to end because that was the one. But then, I'm glad it didn't. I'm glad I changed it. The editors were basically like, oh, you should really make this more current and bring in more, recent people, which I'm really glad I did, because I think it adds a ton that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Yeah. How long? I'm curious how long, because I forget where you said it. Maybe it was on social media or something, but you said that this is an idea you've had for a long time. Like, how long has it been like formulating? How long have you been working on this? I've
spent over half my life on this book. Literally. Wow. It started as a project my senior year or junior year of college.
Oh, wow.
That was around 2002 or so. And it was basically, I took a like rock and roll history class, and we had to pick songs that somehow were linked as the finale. And this was still like, we were doing it on a cassette tape type thing and like handing in the cassette tape, because I'm like ancient. That's like analog. And I remember the professor even saying, oh, I'm the smartest professor in school. Like, as people's finals, I just have to go to the beach and listen to everybody's mixtapes they made me. And now it's like, he's like, I can't even talk about like a blank, like no one knows what a blank tape is. No one knows what a blank CD is.
Right.
Anyway, so I did this thing. I was always interested in the idea of traveling around, rambling. And that was originally the theme, was the idea, the image of rambling. And then the concept album sort of became like the kind of crux of it all, where it all sort of like that was kind of like the gem idea.
Yeah.
And then it sort of went on to like more punk and stuff afterwards, but it was only the middle part that was about the concept album And then I got to do an independent study my senior year where I started actually writing this. And basically the guy I worked with was said to me, this is the best part, is the concept album part. That's really amazing. And if you're trying to pitch a book, you want to write the best part first. He's like, let's just write about the concept album part and then see. And so that's sort of how it all started. And then like over time, slowly I was like, okay, well, I guess maybe this will just be a concept album book, and just stuff was constantly changing. I mean, there was a lot more about that sort of tying back to the old, rambling type blues and folk people, but that sort of got pushed away as I kind of just was going more for the conversation between the albums.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense having read it. I also like your approach to each album, like not to a point where it becomes like same old, but I feel like each chapter sort of has a formula where you sort of set the scene, you sort of bring in some history, you sort of like tell us why this album exists, and then you take us on a guided tour. Like it's not exactly like a synopsis or a breakdown. It's I say guided tour very intentionally through the album track by track and sort of like show us the scene. And it was good because like my instinct with this sort of book or like a 33 1/3 is always to like, well, let me put on the record while I'm reading, even if like what I'm reading doesn't fit, if I'm reading about a different song, but whatever, is that in some instances here, just because of practicality, I had to read it at work or whatever, like I couldn't always be listening to the music. And I found that even when I wasn't able to hear the songs, and maybe it was an album I didn't know, like we're going to get to it, but I don't know that Iron Maiden album, I still felt like I was in good hands and that I was being taken through it in a way that I was like, oh, I get it. Like, I think I get the core of this. So there's not a question here. It's just sort of me giving you big ups for saying like, I like the way it's structured. And then the end of each chapter is sort of like the impact, like what the album, the dent it made in culture, and then also like maybe some more about the way it is feeding into some other things to come or whatever. Yeah. So yeah.
Definitely. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And that was sort of the whole crux of the whole thing originally was, I get to walk people through albums in a way. Like that seemed like a fun, exciting thing, and it's hard because I did want it to be that it wouldn't be boring if you didn't know the album. Like, obviously, this is a book where certain people are going to buy it and only read 3 chapters and just put the rest away, which is fine.
Right.
But I tried to set everything up so that everything was pretty accessible.
Yeah. And I think it's got to be hard with an album because, like, obviously some songs on an album, like the artist has got things that you can sort of pull, like, and like, this is their comment on this song and this is what it sounds like. But like, some of them are just like, going back to Tommy, like some of them are just fiddle about and like, what can you say about it apart from like, well, it sounds like this and it was a song. Like, yeah.
Right. And then there's also a question of then the public like correcting the record, because with like the Thick as a Brick we were talking about earlier, Ian Anderson has that great quote about how, concept albums were getting ridiculous and he wanted to make fun of them. And he lists all these bands like Yes and like all these albums that were like these sort of big overblown concept albums at the time. But I had a different book that pointed out that was a history of prog rock that pointed out that all the albums and artists he named wouldn't actually make those records to like 73, 74.
Right.
So it's only like looking back on it that he's like, well, here, Yes did that, Tales of Topographic Seas or whatever, which was another album.
But they had to get through a few other ones to get to that one. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And, so it's just, it's funny because then you don't want to be the jerk who's like, actually,
Right.
It's like, let Ian Anderson talk. It's Ian Anderson.
Thank you. And actually I like a lot of this book. That's a really fun chapter. Just, I think because of the Ian Anderson quotes like that you brought in. Yeah, totally.
It was fun. It's most fun finding quotes and interviews and stuff. I will say that the whoever runs the Joni Mitchell stuff and the Liz Phair stuff, their websites have basically every press thing done about them from the very beginning. It's all totally free, so it's like whatever the Joni Mitchell page is and whatever the Liz Phair page is. It's beautiful.
Oh, awesome!
I found so much old stuff that you wouldn't even know.
The promise of the internet realized.
Yeah, finally, I know.
Okay, cool. So let's move to the next section. The next section you call the Modern Era. It's from 1975 to 89. We've got Parliament's Mothership Connection, Donna Summer's Once Upon a Time, Husker Du's Zen Arcade, Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, and De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising. So actually a pretty varied section here. And you're covering, you're also covering like 15 years, but like, yeah, it's a pretty varied chunk here.
Yeah, it's, I guess I'll just read the first part of the Once Upon a Time one.
Okay, nice.
So I talk about the Broadway musical being like, and the cast album being a direct precursor to the long playing albums being like a non-classical albums hits, and then sort of the concept album as well. And so I mentioned Hair, which was like, the first great rock one in 1968 that then became like all these productions that launched all these careers. So among the countless up-and-coming performers to get their break in Hair was 19-year-old African-American singer and actress Donna Summer, then known as LaDonna Gaines, who played one of the leads in the 1968 Munich production. It was all part of my fairy tale existence in a beautiful country that I had completely fallen in love with, Summer wrote of Germany in her autobiography, Ordinary Girl, The Journey. She later explained, imagine falling asleep in a quaint German bed and breakfast to awaken with the dawn to the smell of Lebkuchen, gingerbread. I probably destroyed that pronunciation. And my then boyfriend, Ronnie, calling me from outside in a horse-drawn carriage. I quickly ran to the balcony, threw open the doors, and stepped barefoot into 2 feet of white virgin snow. It was a real-life Christmas snow globe with Neuschwanstein Castle towering above us, which was the Walt Disney's inspiration for Cinderella's castle. It was as mystical and surreal a vision that I will never forget, one that every girl should be allowed to experience at least once. The fairy tale scene stayed with Summer. A few years later, she was a single mom in Munich struggling to make ends meet. Summer took in singing jobs whenever she was available, which led her to Giorgio Moroder, an Italian-born record producer who worked with his partner, English-born Pete Belliot, at his Music Land studio in Munich. To Moroder, Summer was a true anomaly, a professional African-American female singer in Germany. She sang on scores of demos that they wrote together, including 1975 Love to Love You Baby. And so out of this came the album Once Upon a Time, which I say is one of the best organized concept albums ever made. Unlike many other concept albums, Donna Summer's masterpiece can be followed from its first listen. And yet, all its reliance upon one of the oldest stories in human history, Cinderella, it maintains a clarity that never wallows in cliche. The album is divided into 4 acts, one for each side, 3 of which are programmed as an extended suite of music. Indeed, upon its initial release, many discos played each side like it was one big song. All the songs were written by Summer, Moroder, and Bellote, which speaks to the team's versatility and focus. So that's a little bit about Donna Summer. And that's one, like I was saying, that's one of the albums that I would have never listened to that I'm like, this is a really cool album.
And with albums like that, was someone proposing them to you, or were you just like researching the era and like, I need something, or?
Kind of both, depending on what it was. In this one of the early editor feedback things I got back when I was still pitching it was, you leave out Donna Summer. And at the time I had the Ramones' first album in the book. That was always like my little hill to die on. Because I think in hindsight, it was sort of more of an anti-concept album. But I always saw the idea of them all like dressing the same, pretending they're brothers, having these like 2-minute songs that all sound the same, one after the other. It struck me as conceptual. Like it really, and it still does. Like that first record, actually the first 4 records, but especially the first one. Because it's all like so cookie cutter basic and like pre-programmed. Anyway, this editor was like, how can you include the Ramones, which no one even thinks is a concept album, and then leave out Summer? And I sort of was like, and so Donna Summer. So, I mean, I knew she made some like, Bad Girls or whatever, but I didn't realize how much her records leading up to that were really a progression where like she did one of all like songs about different seasons, and then the next one was like songs for different eras. So she was sort of like really working with themes and like collective ideas. And then I feel like it's all just completely blown wide open with Once Upon a Time, which is sort of her telling a disco version of Cinderella, which actually was like the least big hit of all of her albums. Like it was actually kind of a flop. And she doesn't even mention it in her autobiography, which shocks me because she goes through a lot of the records that she made because that was her bread and butter, or her gingerbread and butter.
Her Leb cooking or whatever it is. Yeah.
Das ist gut. I know. So,
I don't even know that much. So
I just thought the old Past Master CDs always had the Beatles, their 2 German songs.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Anyway, she was someone that was suggested to them like, oh wait, no, this is good. And it did, I was definitely strongly encouraged to have diversity in the book, and female stories, like gay stories, just all sorts of stories.
Yeah.
Which I, again, would sort of enrich and sit. There's definitely this feeling with rock and roll somewhere in the mid to late 60s where it's like some people just sort of stopped including like black performers. And, it's like, well, rock and roll in the 70s is like Led Zeppelin. It's not like, Stax or whatever. Like, it's not Isaac Hayes. Even though the conversation happening between rock and soul, or beer, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you've got the Talking Heads. One of their best songs is a cover of, Take Me to the River. Like, what's that all about?
Right.
Like Al Green, you're going to just like pretend like Al Green never happened. I think it's a little preposterous. So I'm definitely a big fan of like, it's all like Aretha Franklin, James Brown, like pile them in the same pile with Elvis and like the Beatles and everybody.
Yeah.
Because the beauty of rock and roll only happened because the sound can't be contained. It's like everything was mixing up. And in fact, I have a theory. Well, I'll keep it to myself, but I have a theory about that. And
maybe off mic we can discuss it. But
off mic I'll say that just in case. It's a good idea. But the fact is that they're. I wanted to keep the hip hop in there, because some people are like, oh man, like what's Notorious B.I.G. doing in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? I'm like, he's Notorious B.I.G. Like, where are you going to put him? Like, you're going to just leave him out because he's a rapper? Like, it's all part of the same general narrative.
Yeah, so, no, I definitely agree with that. Speaking of which, so I'm interested why you selected 3 Feet High and Rising, which I think is definitely a classic album. There's no denying it's a classic album, and it does have this weird skit framework, but like what tips it over to you that you're like 3 Feet High and Rising, that's a concept album?
For me, it's funny because someone asked me earlier in a different interview if there were any albums I picked that like the artist didn't think they were concept albums, and that would be 3 Feet High and Rising, where they're on record saying this is not a concept album. We just did that stupid skit thing. Like, we didn't even know that was going to be in the record. Like, we just did that 2 days, while we were mixing. And then Prince Paul made it like the whole like running gag.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, it's still there, because what I always heard the album as, it's a game show, and then the songs are the commercials. And which I think is like brilliant. And even if it wasn't totally intended from their side, I think it still has better structure than like a lot of great albums, even if it is sort of silly and sort of an afterthought. That said, the bigger theme that I really wanted to do is there's like these 3 golden albums. It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back by Public Enemy, Daylight Soul and Rising, and 3 Feet High, Daylight Soul, 3 Feet High and Rising, and then the Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique, where these 3 sort of albums were made in this very small window of time where no one was really policing copyright of the actual original samples.
Right.
And so for me, and I work, like, my day job's in the copyright office, so I'm like fascinated by sort of copyright tales. And so of these 3, I feel like the one that got kind of crucified was 3 Feet High and Rising.
Yeah.
Because the Turtles was that song heard their, song from actually their concept album, the Turtles present Battle of the Band.
Right, where they pretend to be they're a different band each track or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And it was Eleanor, which no, you showed me, which that was the song they used it for the French talking track, and it's beautiful. And they got so mad and felt like they were disrepresented. But then there's just so much you can say about this. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, like even the quote, I assume it's from Mark Volman in the book that you grab, or maybe it's just their representative, is saying like they feel like their song has been mutilated, and it's like, no, like your song still exists. It's fine. Like it's its own thing, but like it's been reinvigorated. Like I genuinely feel like like there's definitely some songs that take a sample and it's so lazy, and I'm just like, you did nothing here. But like everything on 3 Feet High and Rising, like they're what they're doing is so creative. Like, yeah, it's not mutilation. It's definitely not.
And it's fun. And I like the general just concept of this then like groundbreaking use of samples as instruments, basically, as layered samples instead of, Phil Spector would get like 12 guitarists. Well, these guys would stack like 5 different samples. And I felt conceptually there was something to that too. And then especially then with the reaction they got where, up until earlier this year or last year, the album wasn't even available on iTunes. And he has that great line about how it's in the Congressional Recording Registry, but you can't get it on iTunes,
right?
Because all the lawsuits and everything, which is just insane. And now that's changed. Everyone's really come around, but I found all that fascinating, and the idea of like what is a record, like how something it becomes this sort of media currency, that then you can build into something else. And so all that, then the fact that it did have like the silly skits being the sort of tie between it, I sort of was like, I think this could work, basically. And while something like Paul's Boutique, I'd love to sit down and figure out which one uses more samples, because those are the two that are like super sample heavy. But 3 Feet High and Rising, I think, just had more of like a collective vision. They had their whole like Daisy Age and stuff, whereas Beastie Boys had the vision, but it's just sort of a lot more adolescent. Whereas De La Soul seemed to really be trying to do stuff on different levels in terms of like some of our songs are for kids, some of our songs are like social commentary, some of our songs are just stupid, we're just cracking each other up. And I also like kind of the, even though they deny being hippies, there's still their use of flowers and bright colors and stuff, which I think is sort of a callback to Pepper. I think there's a line between like, say, Pepper, like Funkadelic, and then De La Soul in terms of like the kind of like bright Technicolor day glow.
Yeah. I'll buy that. I'll buy that for sure. We should move on, but real quick, I just wanted to say there's more than one punk album, but is Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son the only metal album here? Yeah,
and that was another suggestion by the editors. They said you don't have any heavy metal albums, and that's the genre that kept it going for so long. Mm-hmm. But then once I started actually digging, I couldn't find too many like front to back concept albums. Mm-hmm. And I have a friend who was super into metal, and he was like my metal junkie friend that knew everything. And he basically wrote back and was like, he's like, yeah, you consider this, you consider that, but like he's like, really, Seventh Son is going to be the one.
Interesting.
And that was the one that on other lists I was finding online, that was always on the list somewhere, was Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. So
I was just going to ask if it was like a particular favorite or why that was the one selected. Cause like, I think as a non-metalhead who vaguely knows stuff, I was like, I feel like, and it's all relative, but I feel like, what is it? The Operation Mindcrime feels like the maybe slightly better known, like metal concept album. But also I think that one's like more, well, they're both narratives, right? Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is it's based on, who is it based on?
It was I'm not going to remember the author's name, but it's loosely based on this science fiction, New Age type.
Was it Orson Scott Card? Was it that guy?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, good.
That's right. You're right on that.
Yeah.
I just, that was the one that sort of, from everything I could tell, that was like a very safe one to choose. And, I did. And I had that great, when I got the Bruce Dickinson, when I got his autobiography and he's talking about the thing, he's like, we're going to make a concept album. And I saw this direct line between that and Spinal Tap, because, the whole stone, like where he says it like it's like he's just solved world hunger or something like that, where he's just like, I know what we can do, like Stonehenge. And it's this sort of like,
right.
That's really where the concept albums now become this like punchline.
Yeah.
And so just to then hear him write his biography completely earnestly, being like, it had story, it had great music, it had it all, like Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And I was like, oh, I love that you write like this and that you're heavy metal.
Nice.
And then the fact that it then is about prophecy, and then, it actually, there was that concert that they played where like a couple guys got like trampled to death in the mud. Right. That was crazy. And I was like, holy cow. So it was just a lot of crazy things coming together.
Yeah, and like going in not knowing that album and then reading the chapter, like I think that one's a particularly good example of really, just really feeling your writing guiding me through, and also like starting off with the Spinal Tap comparison, which you do in the chapter, I think is a very good way to disarm someone that's like, what is this album? But like, it's great.
Right.
Okay, let's move on. So part 4 you call the postmodern era, and it's basically the 90s. And the five you have here is Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville, 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral, Notorious B.I.G.'s Ready to Die, Radiohead's OK Computer, and Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. So did you have an excerpt you wanted to go from here?
Either do Liz Phair or Notorious B.I.G.
Okay.
Do you have a preference?
You know what? Do Liz Phair.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't think I've done a female one yet.
Nice.
Okay. One day in 1991, a 24-year-old Chicago-based singer-songwriter named Liz Phair stumbled across a cassette tape of the Rolling Stones' double album, Exile on Main Street, that someone had left behind in her apartment. I listened to it over and over again, Phair remembered, and it became like my source of strength. My involvement with Exile was like an imaginary friend. Whatever Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, was saying, it was a conversation with him, or I was arguing with him. It was kind of an amalgam of the men in my life. For Phair, the album was like an unfinished story, a script missing half its dialogue. She made it her mission to complete it. Phair signed with Matador Records in 1992, which she secured after her homemade Girly Sound tapes became an underground sensation. As an unknown female artist betting her debut on a double record response to the finest album by the biggest rock and roll band in the world, Phair had her work cut out for her. I took it like a thesis, Phair explained on MTV's 120 Minutes in 1994. What I did was I just took the Exile on Main Street album, like lyrically and just in terms of like arrangement, sequencing, and I answered it my own way. I treated mixed lyrics like a sort of love object. He was what the man was saying, and this is what I was coming back with. And it was kind of like this little dance between the two albums. It was a special kind of concept album, an answer album. Phair took the Stones' album and created a track-by-track response, even arranging the number of songs on each side to mirror the Stones' original. And while the Stones' album title referred to fleeing the UK on tax charges, Phair's exile was closer to home. Borrowing a word from fellow Chicagoan Urge Overkill's 1992 Goodbye to Guyville, Phair named her project Exile in Guyville. As she explained in 2018, Guyville was a specific scene in Chicago, predominantly male indie rock, and they had their own little establishment of like who was cool, who was in it, who played in what band. Inspired to prove herself among the guys of Guyville, Phair crafted a record about gender in modern society as modeled on an album by a group of men who were the establishment of male rock star coolness. Phair's audacity outstripped everything except her talent, although being unknown worked in her favor. As Greil Marcus wrote in 2014 about Phair taking on the Stones, it was a dare. Someone who no one's ever heard of can say as much, can say more, than someone everyone's heard of, whom everyone listens to, and in her own voice. Such a story is always new, and it's new now. Part of Exile in Guyville's intrigue was that its concept hides in plain sight. So if one is not familiar with Phair's intentions and the Rolling Stones' back catalog, they would entirely miss it. As a testament to Phair's artistry, one can love the album without knowing the concept that drives it. For our purposes here, however, we will focus on how Guyville answers Main Street. More than any other album we've looked at, Guyville is an interactive concept album, an unfinished puzzle, and one that requires active participation on the listener's part to put it together. At a time when the divide between indie and mainstream rock was shrinking, Phair further bridged the gap by creating a new indie album that spoke directly to a classic mainstream album. As a marketing strategy, it was clever. As a gesture to break into the male-dominated music industry, it was revolutionary.
Great. It's interesting, too, because my personal relationship, I guess, with Exile in Guyville is I first heard Liz Phair's follow-up album, Whip Smart, and then went backwards. And then found out the concept. So like I was one of those that was just oblivious and was like, oh, good record. And then went back and then kind of did a little bit what you do in the chapter and like, you know, present the song from Exile on Main Street and then show how Liz is answering it. And she's not like doing like a one-to-one, like this sounds like this, or she's not doing a one-to-one, like this is a direct response. You know, it's like, it's a little more nuanced, a little better. And I'm glad you did that work. So I didn't have to. So
there's a lot. I mean, a lot of it was already done in interviews and other people's writing. So
yeah,
but I love playing that. Yeah, because it's not like a Weird Al thing. It's not like she's like, oh, I'm just gonna, take this. She even said like some of the songs I went by the vibe, just how the song felt to me. Other times I like answered a question or like put myself in dialogue. So that was sort of part of the fun, the intrigue and the mystery too, was sort of trying to piece it all together.
Yeah.
Music nerds, that's like really fun.
Yeah, totally. So in the 90s, you have a couple that, I guess OK Computer, it does feel like, even if it's not articulated, that you get this sense that this is an album about one thing, kind of. So that one I get, and maybe it could be said the same thing about Downward Spiral, but I was actually texting with someone about like, oh, what are some of the albums? And I was like, Downward Spiral. And they're like, well, wait, why not The Fragile? Like that feels so much more like an explicit like concept album versus the, and I was like, I don't know, I'll ask. So this is me asking, like, what spoke to you in Nine Inch Nails catalog that you're like, Downward Spiral is the pick? Downward
Spiral for me was like I know that Pretty Hate Machine was like for its day a very huge breakthrough.
Yeah.
But I mean, I personally remember when Downward Spiral came out, and that seemed to just blow everything else away.
Yeah.
And the videos are made for it and everything. And the fact that it landed in the 90s, like I wanted to, The Fragile, I think I want to say was like 2002 or something, or 2000. So that's a little bit beyond the scope. But again, I sort of, whenever I was questioning, same thing with what we were talking earlier about with Pink Floyd, I usually went with the earlier one.
Okay.
Because I feel like that's kind of where they're first sort of crystallizing it. And sometimes that's where you get kind of the truest sort of story of what they're trying to tell.
Yeah.
And, and with the Downward Spiral, I definitely see it as like, the title gives it away. Like it is this downward spiral, and it gets more and more messed up, like as you listen to it. But there's also just so much fascinating stuff going on. And he's another guy who seemed to like, him and Jimi Hendrix seemed to talk to like everybody that ever put a microphone in front of them. There's just like so many little interviews. So, and he definitely, like Trent Reznor's obviously no dummy and has done a lot of self-reflection on stuff like this. Yeah. But I also thought it was interesting too, because the way it works with then, it almost sets up the Notorious B.I.G. album. Just this whole idea of like, I just feel like the concept album overall gets darker. I don't know if that's like society's getting darker or what, but those with OK Computer are just sort of three albums that arguably are about like people dying, or like you're following them on the path downward. So that's why I went with I guess I truth be told, I know that I know Downward Spiral better than The Fragile and stuff. So it was easier for me to kind of like sink my teeth into like I remember so
yeah, and it's your book, so
right. And that's the thing is that I say in the intro, and I mean it, is like these aren't supposed to be the greatest or even the most influential. Like this is just 25 albums that I felt like gave the scope, told the story.
And I do, in addition to what you're saying about the themes of death, the thing that I find by picking these 5 albums for the 90s is that it is sort of like squirming both within a concept and then like refusing to own up to it a little bit. Like especially like I think the quote you have from it might be Tom York in the OK Computer is like, this is not a concept album, but it's like, have you listened to OK Computer, Fred? Like, of course it would fit. Yeah. Like, yeah.
And that was one of those, I don't know if it all made the book, but at one point I was fascinated. Well, I love OK Computer, and I was fascinated by it because everyone says it's a concept album, but then no one has the same idea what the concept is. And at some point I found like 5 different reviews of like 5 different people saying, oh, the concept's blah, 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 blah. No, it's blah, blah. And I just found that fascinating, that now concept album has this sort of token sound, even if people can't, it's not like Ziggy Stardust where, oh, it's an album about Ziggy Stardust. Now it's like society and machines. I don't know.
Right.
I think it was Spin that ended their little description with "or something," and I'm like, I think that's probably kind of that's the 90s way of putting it. Because for a long time I was strongly considering Kid A. I thought Kid A would be a fascinating.
Yeah.
Because they're just one of those bands that but again, I went with the earlier one. I went with the one that more people know. And I sort of forgot what a lightning rod that album is because already people have been like asking me about that one specifically. So,
oh really?
Yeah, but it's a freaking beautiful album. So then you were saying earlier that you questioned my 90s choices. You felt like there was stuff that was left out.
Well, I guess it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't that. I think it was what I kind of just articulated there is that it's like, it's so funny to me that I think a lot of these albums would actively try to resist being called concept albums. But I mean, you've won me over. Like I think they all deserve a place in the book I didn't write that you wrote instead.
Thank you. Well, and someone said to me along the lines too. They were like, well, once you get into Notorious B.I.G., like that's just like a rap album. I'm like, but I hear it as an autobiography. Like if you listen to, just some like The Chronic, like that's not a concept album the same way. I mean, it is in terms of creating a lifestyle sort of atmosphere, but whereas I hear Ready to Die as like from his childhood through his death, basically, or a version of it.
I think that actually the hip hop ones are kind of the strongest one because especially like we'll get into part 5, but like the story in Good Kid, Mad City, like he explicitly says like it's a short film, like it's basically like a mind movie and told out of order, but like it's a mind movie for you. All right, so your last section is part 5, the new millennium. You've got Brian Wilson's Smile, Green Day's American Idiot, Janelle Monáe's The Archandroid, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City, and then the last one you have, which is in the title from the Beatles to Beyonce, is Beyonce's Lemonade. What would you like to sample for us?
I was going to read some of the Janelle Monáe album.
All right,
there's another one of those albums that I really knew nothing about, and I was like, this kicks ass. This is great.
Yeah.
So the album stars, she plays a character named Cindy Mayweather in the album. So this part starts for both Cindy Mayweather and Janelle Monáe. Freedom is everything. In 2016, Monáe said, I owe it to myself and to those who fought for my freedom to be free as much as I can. 3 years earlier, Monáe was asked if she felt encouraged to bury her individualism and conform to set standards at the beginning of her career. I never take those things personally, and I am not a victim, she answered diplomatically. But I had to make sure that I stood up for the things that I believed in. The right to wear a tuxedo, the right to have a concept album. When you feel like your rights are being taken away from you, you start to rebel, which has really worked for my career. The right to have a concept album. These words stop me cold. Concept albums have long been the cliché domain of white male rockers. As a black female performer in 2010, Monáe still felt like she had to fight for her right to have a concept album 3 decades after Donna Summer helped pave the way. This form, which was founded on the music breaking free of the record, is now something that must be fought for as a freedom. If you listen to the album from the beginning to the end without skipping, you'll hear there is a story. And we like to think of the music as transformative because it is very diverse, Janelle Monáe once said about the Archandroid. I mean, in terms of influence, it encompasses all the things I love. Plus, I do consider it genderless because I feel the music itself is so much bigger than the labels and categories.
And it's interesting because I kind of like, I forget what the first EP is. Is it The Chase? Was the EP before that album?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So like I listened to that. I listened to Archandroid. I listened to Electric Lady, and it's funny because like on the cover, it's like this is part 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 of so many parts, and then you talk about it a little bit. Then she just was like, you know what? I'm gonna let it go. Me and Cindy Mayweather, we kind of got where we're going, and like, who cares what part 6 and 7 is? Like, I now I'm just Janelle Monáe, like, and I kind of love that.
She was going to do like 4 or 5 parts or something originally. She kept on expanding it.
Right.
So. I hope one day it's like a George Lucas thing, and she makes like a whole set of movies about it, and it'll be like, oh, like that'd be magical.
Yeah.
Because she can do anything. She's phenomenal. But yeah, no, it is funny to see her sort of curate it as she goes.
Right. Well, cool. I'm glad that we were able to sort of get through a lot of the book. Obviously, we all have copies in the Arts Annex over at Skylight Books. You can also purchase online at skylightbooks.com. You should check it out. 50 Years of the Concept Album in Popular Music, from the Beatles to Beyonce, by Eric Wolfson. I hope we've whet your appetite, because there is definitely much more to dig into. Did you have any parting thoughts?
Just that I intend the book to, like I was saying, not to be a definitive history as much as the beginning of a conversation. This is the first major book to tell the story of the concept album, and I felt like the best way to do that was through the albums themselves.
Yeah.
And so if somebody's like, this book stinks because you didn't include Genesis, or I'm like, great, like write me the book that has Genesis in it. Like I'm the first, I'll be the first to read it. Like that sounds great, or maybe I do a sequel book one day if this is popular enough. But I'm not trying to be the end all be all, but I'm still bracing myself for, people being like, where's Marillion or whatever. And I'm going to be like,
yeah, no, I'm sure there's a lot of prog nerds that are going to be like, what are you talking? Actually, what was it? Yeah, my Alan, who co-hosts the movie podcast that we do as part of this series, he was like, he doesn't write about Mastodon? What the hell? So for the next book, there'll be Mastodon, there'll be Genesis, there'll be Marillion, there'll be all the nerd bands for all you nerds. But first, you got to buy this book and buy for all of your friends and all of your family. Thanks again for coming on the podcast, Eric. Thank you for listening, and
thank you.
We'll see you next time. Yes, thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.